Hello everyone, I hope you're all doing well. Today we are going to talk about Henry Fielding's quite fun novel, Joseph Andrews. We talked about it last week. We said that it is partly a satirical play on Richardson's Pamela, because the character here is the fictional brother of a fictional character that we already discussed in Pamela, the novel itself. In order to have some parallelisms between the two novels, I wanted to emphasize for you certain parts in Pamela, and so that you could now rely on these similarities and how actually Fielding makes fun of the novel itself. It starts out as a project. Henry Fielding started this out as a parody of the character itself and how Samuel Richardson deals with the presentation of the character or the issue of morality and virginity that befalls on Pamela. Sorry. And here in this case we have her brother Joseph, but Joseph is also equally moral, equally virtuous as a character, but as a male character, as a male protagonist, actually the things that concern Pamela in her own life, in her own virtuous journey, do not directly affect her brother in real life, I mean, the 18th century society. There is this bias of against women. We already discussed that Pamela actually stands for that bias because she is part of that ideology as well, that patriarchal overview of women, whose only view is that they can be like property. This is something that is quite concerning actually in terms of women's case in that era, because they could be they are property, considered to be property of the husband or their fathers, and they are more valuable if they keep their virginity to till the marriage part. And the story was the epitome of this idea of protecting your virginity. We said that Pamela, although she likes some kind of likes the owner of the house, and he treats her quite kindly every time at first when he tries to gain her heart. But when she rejects him and his attempts to seduce her, then he becomes more and more wild in his attempts. And we talked about the scenes of disguise where he put on even a servant's dress and went to Pamela's room closet. And we said that at that part Pamela loses herself. She doesn't want to yield to his desires, although it looks to her that it would be quite a profitable marriage if she married to the Lord, Mr. B, but she denies it. She's a good Christian, and we learn a lot about her morals through the exchanges of these letters with her parents. The story actually that how Pamela reacts to the attempts of her seducer, of her master, are parodied here in Henry Fielding's novel Joseph Andrews. In Fielding's novel, we have Joseph as a character, as a male character, being attacked by a lady, a lady in his household, and he feels quite vulnerable to these attempts. And there's also another character in this novel that we will be talking a lot about, and it is Parson Adams. He is a naive character, and their journey with Joseph Adams and Joseph, are quite capturing us scenes from the 18th century society in England. And although this novel started out as a parody of Pamela in the first place, we could still expect more from the novel. We should, because it gives us a portrayal of that society. Therefore, it fulfills both the aims of entertaining and informing us about the 18th century. And with the use of parody or satire and burlesque that many of the aspects of Joseph Andrews are associated with, actually, we can say that Fielding follows quite a neoclassical approach towards while attempting to write this novel. We will be talking about Fielding and Joseph Andrews more, actually, in this lecture, but I hope you have started at least reading the novel for today's lecture. Most of the students, as I told you before, have difficulty in trying to read that novel, and most of the questions come from the idea that we don't know what he is talking about, and the language can be a barrier too, depicting a typical 18th century English style. In this novel, Fielding's language might be a little bit difficult for you, but this is again my advice for you, that you should go for these free websites where we have summary of each chapter, where we have all the ideas presented to us, and after that try to read the novel by yourselves. But read it, do not rely on summaries, do not rely on others' ideas, but experience the novel yourselves, because it's one of the most enjoyable 18th century works you can find out there. And this is why I actually included it in our studies. And after Joseph Andrews, there is one more novel that we are going to talk about, The Castle of Otranto, a Gothic fiction. And it will be a survey of, at the end of the semester, you will gain the chance to look at the novels and see and identify 18th century novels' characteristics in each of them, with quite different aspects as well as similarities. Therefore, I hope you have started reading your novels, and if you haven't, I think you should do it by yesterday. It's urgent. We don't have so many weeks for you to wait and complete your readings and then watch these videos and try to gain some insights into the novels. It will be late. So please try to start reading the novels and analyzing them, looking at the websites or our libraries. Search for some articles which might be quite beneficial for you, actually, to explore the ideas in it. But with these lectures, you can be more affiliated with the ideas and the style Fielding provides for us in this novel. And I think it will be a little bit more easier for you if you first read the novel and then watch these videos. All right, let's start discussing how Henry Fielding started out his career and how he came up with the idea of Joseph Andrews and his style. Let's talk about these first and then move on to the analysis of the novel. Again, before moving on to that, I would like to show you this site that you know, I think, right now, because I used this one for our Pamela discussion too. Gutenberg.org. In this one, it's free of access, free of use, so this is why I can use it here easily without hesitation, without any infringement of copyright. And this is the version that I will be following, but do not worry if you get the hard copy of the novel. You can easily follow me, I guess, because we have now chapters here and books even. You see, book 1, book 2, and you can rely on all these hints that I will be showing you here by underlining, by talking about specifically. I will show you here in this website, and you can also rely on this website too. It's free, as I told you, and follow up your reading. Maybe it's, if it is more convenient for you to do it an online reading, this is the site that you should be referring to. In the introduction part, actually there is a lot of new things to learn from that I suggest you shouldn't skip the general introduction part, where it talks about Henry Fielding and his life, and later on the appreciation of his novel and his career. They are all told here, and it is very good for you to not to skip this part as well. All right. We will start with, after the introduction, the author's preface. It's very important for us, that we will be talking about in a moment. All right. Joseph Andrews was actually written as a reaction to Richardson's Pamela. There is also one novel too called Shamala, an apology for the life of Mrs. Shamala Andrews. This was attributed to Fielding as well, that the author is unknown. The work was published in 1741, Shamala, and it's again a parody of Pamela. And this time it offers us, the subtitle gives us an apology for the life of Mrs. Shamala Andrews. But Henry Fielding didn't accept that it was his work. He didn't claim the novel. And he published this Joseph Andrews later on. And this is, let me say, a more sophisticated version of a satire or burlesque in that tradition than Shamala, which is more about an exaggerated form of parody, let us say. All right, and Joseph Andrews actually imitates the style of Cervantes, who wrote Don Quixote, one of the first novels one of the first works that could be labeled as the novel. As early as the 16th century, we have in this work we have the idea of a chaotic journey of Joseph Andrews and Parson Adams, like Don Quixote and Sancho Panza. In this masterpiece that it is called Joseph Andrews, we could find irony, examples of burlesque, social criticism, and literary criticism as well, because it's a parody of another literary work of his time. It shows how people are hypocrites when it comes to virtue or morality, which actually dominated their lives, which directed their lives at the time, but they didn't think that they were hypocrites. They didn't think that morality is something that they should have, but rather it's something that they should show off with, rather. Henry Fielding was born in Dorset, it's the west of England, and he was coming from an upper class family. He was the son of a general, and he inherited a lot of wealth from this family, and he gained a lot of opportunities for education, and this was truly shown through his work because of his use of language, his references to works. He was well read into, for instance, Russian literature as well. He was a fan of Tolstoy and Dostoevsky, and he admired their works and their styles, their analysis of their own society. We could identify all these qualities in his works, not only in Joseph Andrews, but in other works as well. He also wrote Jonathan Wild and Tom Jones, and his last novel is Amelia. It was in 1751. It gives a very serious depiction of the 18th century England. You should think that as an 18th century novelist, Henry Fielding himself was quite into his material, that 18th century society and people. He observed their mannerisms, he observed their values, what they value in life, and he made a parody out of that. And therefore, it is quite obvious that he tried to do the same with Pamela, because I told you that there were many Pamelas living in that society who maybe couldn't resist the attempts of their masters, and they were just abused at the end, and they were left out. Pamela is a story of a success, therefore, for her own individual life. She is celebrated, therefore, she is rewarded at the end. Her virtue is rewarded. That was the subtitle, remember. And for Fielding, he wanted to show that although this was expected from women, although it was associated with morality, or virtue is associated with virginity of women, men, on the other hand, did not think of anything like that. They weren't bothered with something like that. But he changed the roles, the gender roles of the protagonists, and showed the case that the society was being hypocritical. This was his aim to show. And you will see that when we are dealing with especially 19th century novel, this idea of hypocrisy will gain more and more importance. And we will be talking about how Victorian society, so-called a virtuous one, wanted to rely on these ideas, concepts of constructed morality. And hypocrisy, therefore, will be one of the themes that many writers explored at that time. But Henry Fielding started to talk about it in advance, we can say. He led the way for others. All right, let me check my other notes in relation to Joseph Andrews and Henry Fielding himself. You will see, this is also a note that I would like to talk about in relation to his life. Fielding, I talked about Fielding's education. He was educated in law, and he was admitted to the bar. He was now part of jurisdiction system in England, and he was a Justice of Peace for Westminster. What does that mean? Does that ring any bells to you? I don't know, but if not, you should check what Justice of Peace would do in that system. So he has the potential to judge, to make some cases. And as a person of jurisdiction, he was quite into the government system, he was quite into the manners of people, and he wanted to talk about the inequalities or the unjust decisions that were made in this system. And in the novel, there are many parts in which people experience the dilemma of whether thinking what is right and what is not to do. They are talking about the punishment of the characters, for instance. And in relation to inheritance issue, for instance, that we have also a mention in the novel, Fielding uses his own professional outlook and brings about his critical insight in relation to the application of these rules in society, and how the rules were quite abused by the people. He draws our attention to that as well. So we should think that his experience, his personal experience in the judicial system becomes a part of the lenses that he wears and he puts in discussion in this novel. Therefore, when you come to the parts where it talks about the legal issues or where it criticizes how this jurisdiction system fails to defend the rightful ones, you will see that it is because Fielding had such an experience professionally, and he used that to criticize, to make social criticisms in his work in this one. All right, I think it is now clear that we have a picture of who Fielding is in our minds and what was his aim in writing this novel. And we will continue with the preface that he wrote for this novel. And in this preface, which is very, very important for us to know about. We get to hear Henry Fielding's own words about his own work. He introduces us to the novel himself, thus guiding us how to read the novel. It's the preface provides that for us. So we should hear what he says in the preface part. Author's preface. As it is possible, the mere English reader may have a different idea of romance from the author of these little volumes, and may consequently expect a kind of entertainment not to be found, nor which was even intended, in the following pages, it may not be improper to premise a few words concerning this kind of writing, which I do not remember to have seen hitherto attempted in our language. You see that he is aware of his own experimentation with the style, that whatever you might expect from a romance, you might not find it exactly in this novel, and whatever entertainment you are expecting will not be provided with that novel for you, because he is so experienced, he's so experienced in that style that he knows that this wasn't done before by anyone else. And at that point, I would like to highlight that when we talked about the background of the 18th century novel, I highlighted for you that it was experimental. The novel genre just started to appear, and because of that influence of individualism and because of that appeal for a new distinct style, each writer tried their hand in it, and therefore it was experimental, and Joseph Andrews was no exception to that, as Henry Fielding here in his preface tries to tell us. And he tries to categorize this work. He says, the epic, as well as the drama, is divided into tragedy and comedy. Homer, who was the father of the species of poetry, gave us a pattern of both these, though that of the latter kind is entirely lost, which Aristotle tells us bore the same relation to comedy which his Iliad bears to tragedy, and perhaps that we have no more instances of it among the writers of antiquity is owing to the loss of this great pattern, which, had it survived, would have found its imitators equally with the other poems of this great original. And farther, as this poetry may be tragic or comic, I will not scruple to say it may be likewise either in verse or prose, for though it wants one particular which the critic enumerates in the constituent parts of an epic poem, namely metre, yet when any kind of writing contains all of its parts, such as fable, action, characters, sentiments, and diction, and is deficient in meter only, it seems, I think, reasonable to refer it to the epic, at least as no critic hath thought proper to range it under any other head, or to assign it a particular name to itself. And he thinks that this is if we still continued writing epic or tragedy in the style that the classics did before, he said maybe the critics would draw some parallelisms between these genres and the work that you are going to read. Therefore, he creates his own categorization of the thing that he writes, and he says that actually this is a comic epic poem in prose. A comic epic poem in prose, differing from comedy as the serious epic from tragedy, its action being more extended and comprehensive, containing a much larger circle of incidents and introducing a greater variety of characters. It differs from the serious romance in its fable and action in this, and that as in the one these are grave and solemn, so in the other they are light and ridiculous. It differs in its characters by introducing persons of inferior rank and consequently of inferior manners, whereas the grave romance sets the highest before us. Lastly, in its sentiments and diction, by preserving the ludicrous instead of the sublime. In the diction, I think, burlesque itself may be sometimes admitted, of which many instances will occur in this work, as in the description of the battles and some other places, not necessary to be pointed out to the classical reader, for whose entertainment those parodies or burlesque imitations are chiefly calculated. When you compare Pamela and Joseph Andrews, in terms of even language, that you should see the differences evident there. You can tell that, I don't know if you can tell at that moment, but with my guidance, I think you would come to that conclusion in the end that it would be still quite difficult for 18th century readers to get Joseph Andrews and read it and understand the references or the style, the classical ones that he here talks about, that he makes use of several modes, like burlesque, he uses that. He uses epic in terms of its variety of characters, variety of settings, and he thinks that although this time it is about so-called inferior class, inferior people, rather than giving us the stories of gods and heroes, we have quite lower class characters and a variety of characters that would comprise the 18th century society. It's not talking about, as in the case of serious romances, it's not talking about an ideal world. It's not talking about upper class people and their ideals of the sublime experience. Meaning, sublime means that it is something of the highest aesthetic fulfillment that you can not express with your words. It's the ideal one. But instead, we have the inferior reality of life represented in this work. And with the scenes that he refers that to the mode of burlesque, for instance, he still talks about some kind of battle, but it's something different from those we see in romances or in epics. Therefore, with all the classical contextualization of this novel, because of Fielding's style, as I told you, quite a neoclassical one, and because of his education, because of his professional background, we have all these culminations of different parts that comprise Joseph Andrews for us in the end. It is why I think most of the students have difficulty after Pamela, after Robinson Crusoe, to appreciate this novel. It requires us to be more inquisitive about the literary background of the 18th century. Particularly, we should rely on our knowledge in the neoclassical tradition. So as you keep reading the novel, please try to remember your 18th century neoclassical poetry knowledge, because Fielding is a great neoclassical writer. And therefore, we have many references to the classics as showing us the truth, showing us the way that things should be kept or preserved ideally. But as he notices here, as he makes us understand that this is no world of Homer right now, and What he has as his material is the 18th century England, and he tries to represent that. He cannot do it with a classical form, but he could only rely and reuse these classical forms and genres and modes and create his own idea of a work of the 18th century. This is what he can do and shows us the best example of it in the end. All right. Here he talks about, as we continue reading the preface, I would like to highlight where he talks about this caricature, burlesque. Yes, this one. Now, the paragraph starting with now, and maybe the one before too, these two paragraphs. But to illustrate all this by another science, in which perhaps we shall see the distinction more clearly and plainly, let us examine the works of a comic history painter, with whose performances, which the Italians call caricatura, where we shall find the true excellence of the former to consist in the exactest copying of nature, in so much that a ridiculous eye instantly rejects anything outer, any liberty which the painter had taken with the features of that alma mater, whereas in the caricatura we allow all license. Its aim is to exhibit monsters, not men. All distortions and exaggerations, whatever, are within its proper province. Now, what caricatura is in painting, burlesque is in writing, and in the same manner the comic writer and painter correlate to each other. And here I shall observe that, as in the former the painter seems to have the advantage, so it is in the latter infinitely on the side of the writer. For the monstrous is much easier to paint than describe, and the ridiculous to describe than paint. This is how he considers that he is actually should do a burlesque of the manners that he wants to criticize. He uses that, and he makes a parallelism between painting like caricature, painting a caricature and writing a burlesque is almost the same. You highlight, you exaggerate, you distort reality, and this gives us the effect of amusement in the end. And he says later on, yes, this one. But to return, the ridiculous only, as I have before said, falls within my province in the present work. He wants to represent it as ridiculous. Nor will some explanation of this word be thought impertinent by the reader if he considers how wonderfully it had been mistaken even by writers who have professed it. For to what much such a mistake can we attribute the many attempts to ridicule the blackest villainies, and what is yet worse, the most wrathful calamities? What could exceed the absurdity of an author who should write the comedy of Nero with the merry incidents of ripping up his mother's belly, or what would give a greater shock to humanity than an attempt to expose the miseries of poverty and distress to ridicule? And yet the reader will not want much learning to suggest such instances to himself. Besides, it may seem remarkable that Aristotle, who is so fond and free of definitions, had not thought proper to redefine the ridiculous. Indeed, where he tells us it is proper to comedy, he had remarked that villainy is not its object. But he had not, as I remember, positively asserted what is. Nor doth the Abbé Bellegarde, who had written a treatise on the subject, though he shows us many species of it once trace it to its fountain. The only source of the true ridiculous, as it appears to me, is affectation. By referring to all these classical sources, he tries to come up with the origin of the comedy, of the ridiculous, because this is what he's going to do with this novel. And he says that although there are many explanations, what a tragedy is, especially by Aristotle's definition, we have many key terms that you are familiar with. He makes a very good analysis of what tragedy is. The attention on the comedy is rather weak, and he says that what appears to me is that most of the comedy comes from one important source, and it is affectation. But though it arises from one spring only, when we consider the infinite streams into which this one branches, we shall presently cease to admire at the copious field it affords to an observer. Now affectation proceeds from one of these two causes, vanity and hypocrisy. For as vanity puts us on affecting false characters in order to purchase applause, so hypocrisy sets us on an endeavor to avoid censure by concealing our vices under an appearance of their opposite virtues. And though these two causes are often confounded, for there is some difficulty in distinguishing them, yet as they proceed from very different motives, so they are as clearly distinct in their operations, for indeed the affectation which arises from vanity is nearer to truth than the other, as it had not what violent repugnancy of nature to struggle with, which that of the hypocrite had. It may be likewise noted that affectation does not imply an absolute negation of those qualities which are affected, and therefore, though when it proceeds from hypocrisy, it be nearly allied to deceit, yet when it comes from vanity only, it partakes of the nature of ostentation. For instance, the affectation of liberality in a vain man differs visibly from the same affectation in the avaricious. For though the vain man is not what he would appear, or had not the virtue he affects, to the degree he would be thought to have it, yet it sits less awkwardly on him than on the avaricious man, who is the very reverse of what he would seem to be. Vanity and affectation, affectation has two sources, vanity and hypocrisy, he says. And out of these two sources, usually we have affectation as a behavior, as a feeling that is shown to us. Affectation means pretending for something that you are not. And if it comes from vanity, he says that you are a vain person, that you are too proud not to accept who you are, and you are just putting on another identity, pretending that you don't have that character, but showing yourself as someone else. And it makes you a hypocrite actually in the end. This is the reason why you become a hypocrite or affectionate person in the end. And he says that we can create, therefore ridicule comes from affectation by showing people's pretending to be someone else, and by showing or analyzing the source for that need actually makes a character quite ridiculous. And because of this use of hypocritical affectation that he says, It's only true that where we can talk about even the most calamities in life from a ridiculous perspective. For instance, he says, surely he had a very ill-framed mind who can look on ugliness, infirmity, or poverty as ridiculous in themselves, nor do I believe any man living who meets a dirty fellow riding through the streets in a cart is struck with an idea of the ridiculous from it. But if he should see the same figure descend from his coach in six, or bolt from his chair with his head under his arm, he would then begin to laugh, and with justice. In the same manner, were we to enter a poor house and behold a wretched family shivering with cold and languishing with hunger, it would not incline us to laughter. But should we discover there a grate instead of coals, adorned with flowers, empty plate or china dishes on the sideboard, or any other affectation, riches and finery, either on their persons or in their furniture, we might then indeed be excused for ridiculing so fantastical an appearance. He talks about here, I think, is quite in the line of this idea of decorum that 18th century writers were quite into. That a poor family, if everything looks poor about them, is quite serious as a subject, that we won't be laughing at their poorness. But when we identify an element, an item in their house or on themselves that suggests that they are pretending that they have such an item at their house, they are in a way being hypocritical about who they are, then that would create the effect of the ridicule, he says. He's quite right out there, actually. He makes this idea of decorum works perfectly for his own aim in this novel. All right. Yes, here, having thus distinguished Joseph Andrews from the productions of romance writers on the one hand and burlesque writers on the other, and given some few very short hints, for I intended no more, of this species of writing, which I have affirmed to be hitherto unattempted in our language, I shall leave to my good-natured reader to apply my piece to my observations, and will detain him no longer than with a word concerning the characters in this work. And here I solemnly protest I have no intention to vilify or asperse anyone, for though everything is copied from the book of nature, and scarce a character or action produced which I have not taken from my own observations and experience, yet I have used the utmost care to obscure the persons by such different circumstances, degrees in colors, that it would be impossible to guess at them with any degree of certainty. And if it ever happens otherwise, it is only where the failure characterized is so minute that it is a foible only which the party himself may laugh at as well as any other. In these two paragraphs that I read, that he made the distinctive quality of his work apparent for us, for the good-natured reader that he addresses to the reader like that. And he wants us to read it relying on his observations, and he says that if you see any real life resemblance to any of the characters that you know in real life, then it will be a minor detail, he says, because I try to mix the characters, I try to provide you with quite different situations I contextualize these characters into life and let them experience many things that would distance these characters from their real life representations. It is clever of Henry Fielding to suggest that, yes, he is representing us a version of his reality, and these characters might rely on some real life characters. And although there might be some similarities, he still thinks that this is his version, his observation, so no offense should be taken. He wants us to know that he is giving us a realistic picture, actually, with the means that he has, with the means that he thinks appropriate for this matter. And as to the character of Adams, as it is the most glaring in the whole, so I conceive it is not to be found in any book now extant. It is designed a character of perfect simplicity, and as the goodness of his heart will recommend him to be to the good-natured, so I hope it will excuse me to the gentlemen of his cloth, for whom, while they are worthy of their sacred order, no man can possibly have a greater respect. They will therefore excuse me, notwithstanding the low adventures in which he is engaged, that I have made him a clergyman, since no other office could have given him so many opportunities of displaying his worthy inclinations. Parson Adams, that the character that he creates quite geniusly to represent the 18th century England, because of, as he says, because of his profession, that they could travel from one place to another, and he apologizes to the clergyman by making his character of this profession. But he says this is only because it was quite useful for him. Just for technical reasons, he's saying. He doesn't mean any offense by making such a simple character of good heart a clergyman, because he is deceived with Joseph Andrews. They go through a bunch of journeys where he's actually deceived, and he says that he didn't mean to make clergymen look like that, like a vulnerable people, or like people who could be easily deceived. That he also wants to make sure that the reader shouldn't get that idea from Parson Adams, from that character. All right. Now it is time for just to have a taste of the novel of chapter 1 before we move into the detailed discussions of the novel for next lecture. The title is The History of the Adventures of Joseph Andrews and his friend Mr. Abraham Adams, Parson Adams. In chapter 1, the book starts of writing lives in general, and particularly of Pamela, with a word by the by of Colley Cibber and others. It's it right, but through observation, that examples work more forcibly on the mind than precepts, and if this be just in what is odious and blamable, it is more strongly so in what is amiable and praiseworthy. Here emulation most effectually operates upon us, and inspires our imitation in an irresistible manner. A good man, therefore, is a standing lesson to all his acquaintance, and of far greater use in that narrow circle than a good book. But as it often happens that the best men are but little known, and consequently cannot extend the usefulness of their examples a great way, the writer may be called in aid to spread their history farther, and to present the amiable pictures to those who have not the happiness of knowing the originals, and so by communicating such valuable patterns to the world, he may perhaps do a more extensive service to mankind than the person whose life originally afforded the pattern. In this light, I have always regarded those biographers who late recorded the actions of great and worthy persons of both sexes, not to mention those ancient writers, which of late days are little read, being written in obsolete and, as they are generally taught, unintelligible languages, such as Plutarch, Nepos, and others which I heard of in my youth. Our own language affords many of excellent use and instruction, finely calculated to sow the seeds of virtue in youth, and very easy to be comprehended by persons of moderate capacity, such as the history of John the Great, who, by his brave and heroic actions against men of large and athletic bodies, obtained the glorious appellation of the giant killer, that of an Earl of Warwick, whose Christian name was Guy, the lives of Argolis and Parthenia, and above all, the history of those 7 worthy personages, the champions of Christendom. In all these delight is mixed with instruction, and the reader is almost as much improved as entertained. This is the neoclassical and classical idea, actually, of dulce e utile that we have from the classical literature. Dulce e utile, meaning to teach and delight. It's Horace's idea, Horace's definition, and he thinks that what biographers, both classical and in English literature, in English tradition, contributed to the people to know about great people and their lives, because it need to be spread out. They are examples, and as they are examples, such good examples, they should be known by a large public. And he says, but I pass by these and many others to mention 2 books lately published, which represent an admirable pattern of the amiable in either sex. The former of these, which deals in male virtue, was written by the great person himself, who lived the life he had recorded, and is by many thought to have lived such a life only in order to write it. The other is communicated to us by a historian who borrows his lights, as the common method is, from authentic papers and records. The reader, I believe, already conjectures, I mean the lives of Mr. Colley Cibber and Mrs. Pamela Andrews. How artfully doth the former, by insinuating that he escaped being promoted to the highest stations in church and state, teach us a contempt of worldly grandeur. How strongly doth he inculcate an absolute submission to our superiors. Lastly, how completely doth he arm us against so uneasy, so wretched a passion as the fear of shame. How clearly doth he expose the emptiness and vanity of that phantom repetition. I don't know if you remember Colley Cibber from your drama courses, because he was one of the popular Restoration playwrights. He was at the same time an actor, and the book that he wrote, and here Fielding makes fun of by referring to his own life and what he did in his life, how he rambled upon what he did in his life, is quite important for us. I don't know if you know about Colley Cibber. If you don't, please check it out, check his name out. That I would like to talk about his book. Or have you read anything by him, in a play? Last Shift. It was quite a popular play, Love's Last Shift. It was a restoration play. He was at the same time poet laureate. I was looking for his book, the title of his book actually. It's a long one, like the almost all the 17th or 18th century pamphlets or books, that it doesn't have just one title, short title, but it gives away all the subject in the title. And this is why it has a whole long name. Autobiography, yes. An Apology for the Life of Colley Cibber, Comedian. This is the title of his work. That he means, he refers here, Henry Fielding refers here, and he says that actually what Cibber creates in this work is quite hypocritical. He means that. The text, in the text, he doesn't talk much about his family, but how he dedicated himself to his works, just as Fielding hints us here, Mr. Colley Cibber's work, and how he talks about all these items that make him virtuous. You can see that even with this work, even with this reference at the beginning, and also the classical references that we have, Fielding is not only writing a novel, is not only experimenting with the novel genre, but he is, to a certain extent, creating his own literary critical work in this one. And the second book that he would like to talk about is Mrs. Pamela Andrews. It's about Mrs. Pamela Andrews. And he says, what the female readers are told by the memoirs of Mrs. Andrews is so well set forth in the excellent essays or letters prefixed to the second and subsequent editions of that work, and it would be here a needless repetition. The authentic history with which I now present the public is an instance of the great good that book is likely to do, and of the prevalence of example which I have just observed, since it will appear that it was by keeping the excellent pattern of his sister's virtues before his eyes that Mr. Joseph Andrews was chiefly enabled to preserve his purity in the midst of such great temptations. I shall only add that his character of male chastity, though doubtless as desirable and becoming in one part of the human species as in the other, is almost only virtue which the great apologist had not given himself for the sake of giving the example to his readers. As he closes the first chapter, he says that now I will be talking about Joseph Andrews, Mr. Joseph Andrews, who is a virtuous character and who defends actually male virtue. And he, again, in his last sentence, he says that the apologist he refers to as Colley Cibber at that point, and he says that he wasn't involved in such a virtue at the time, and he didn't represent that ideal, but I'm here providing you with a male character who exceeds his virtuous state, and you will be reading about that, and he is the brother of wonderful virtuous Pamela Andrews as well. For the rivalry or criticism of Colley Cibber and Henry Fielding, I will direct you to this article at the end of this lecture. Henry Fielding's Last Bow at Collisiber. It's here. We have, this is just the preview mode, okay? You can easily download it through our library's account. It is possible for you. If you just write the title of the article, you will get a full text. Since I'm not at school right now and I didn't open that page right now as I record this video, I didn't get the full version, but you can easily get it, as I told you, from the university's library's website. Alright, we will continue with our second chapter for our next lecture. I'm aiming for going into more details and going scenes that would be quite parallel between Pamela and Joseph Andrews. I hope you will catch up with your readings after this lecture, and I hope now it is clearer as a picture for you what Henry Fielding is trying to do with this novel, trying to show us, and his style is, although a little bit complicated, still counts a lot for us, is a lot important for us as students of English literature. We couldn't just skip this novel. We couldn't just talk about it and move on like we did with Pamela, because Pamela was easy to read, and most of the time we were able to follow a storyline, and in this one we will be doing that too, but there are many references and very complicated sentences that you might find it difficult as you read it, or there are at the same time contemporary references that he indulges himself in social criticism, in literary criticism, and even all the time employing his judgments or overview of his own characters and their actions. And it's an experimental novel, as he warns us at the beginning of his novel, at the preface. All right, I think this is all from me today. I hope you have enjoyed this one, and you will be watching the next one next week. For your information, I uploaded 2 documents this week. One is movie list, and the other one is TV series list. The students of the first year students asked me to find where they could find this list about the British history, literature, or culture movies. So these 2 lists concern the topics that I just mentioned, and they are not my favorite movies or TV series. I must have such a list too, but these are just to guide you to the department's study material. You might visualize the plays, adaptations. Therefore, most of them are adaptations, most of them are historical dramas, and there are also British comedies which are quite popular, and I think you should be affiliated with in terms of getting to know more about that culture. So this is just for fun. And I thought it would be proper to have such a list for you, all of you. Therefore, I uploaded these 2 documents. You are not expected to do any kind of bonus work on them, but this is just to guide you in your studies and to have fun. Dulce e utile. my aim too. I'm quite classical in that one. All right. Take care and stay home. These are my to write words, closing remarks actually. Hope to meet you in the next video. Bye bye.